first kind of one of the characteristics of being a community shaped by the gospel is to be a community of genuine love. And we find that in chapter 12, verses 11 through 21. Beginning in verse 9 of chapter 12, Paul says, "Let love be genuine." The gospel should shape a community if they're offering themselves as a living sacrifice. A community of genuine love, authentic love. And here in this section, Paul's going to describe how they should be a community of love for God in verses 11 through 12. A community of love for other Christians in verses 10, 13, 15, and 16. And a community of love for enemies in verse 14 and verses 17 through 21. There are lots of ways to describe love, and probably all of you have heard some of the treatments of the different Greek words for love. The word that Paul uses for love here is where we get the word agape from, or the verb form agapao. And what he's talking about here is an act of love that unselfishly gives regardless of the worthiness of the object being loved. An act of love that unselfishly gives. And so here he's talking about the ability to grow in that kind of love for God. And we read about that in verses 11 and 12 when he says, "Do not lag in zeal, be ardent in spirit, serve the Lord, rejoice in hope, be patient in affliction, persevere in prayer." These are all aspects of loving God by developing consistent devotion for God. And these are some of the ways we do it. So authentic love for God is going to include things like patience in suffering, perseverance in prayer, zeal, ardent spirit, service of God, rejoicing in God, these kinds of things. For other Christians, we show authentic love, genuine love, by demonstrating humble servanthood in our relationship with other Christians. For instance, in verse 10, Paul says, "Love one another with a mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor." In verse 13, "Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers." You get the idea. Demonstrating humble servanthood. That a community shaped by the gospel is going to be a community that loves each other. And of course, the challenge of this is both in the church in Rome, where you have both Jewish Christians and non-Jewish Christians that were diametrically different culturally, diametrically different politically, very different ethnically, is how to live in loving community with people who are different than us. Often we find that Christians are drawn to a church that attracts people just like them. And when that happens, we find ourselves in community with people who think like us, read the books we read, vote like we vote, listen to the music that we listen to, have the ideas and values that we have. And it's easy to love people like that. The gospel calls us to be in loving community with people who are different than us. People who may not look at the world the same way, whose cultural upbringing may be different, whose language may be different, whose voting patterns may be different. That is where the gospel is at work. Our capacity to be in community with people who are different than ourselves. Then finally, this section of Romans 12 is talking about how to love people who we are not in community with. That authentic love will show peaceful harmony in our relationships with those who do not confess Christ. For instance, in verse 14, echoing the words of Jesus, Paul says, "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them." In verse 17 he says, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought to what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all people. Here Paul is describing this call to authentic love. It isn't just a love for God, and it's not just a love for other Christians. It's a love for those outside the Christian community. That we should resist the urge to retaliate, instead trusting those situations to God. That we should do good to those who do evil to us. That we should never avenge ourselves, but that we should leave room for God to avenge. This is the sign of authentic love. Authentic love for God, authentic love for the church, and authentic love for those outside the church, even those who persecute us.